After the Civil War and during Reconstruction, Black Americans in the South struggled to find a balance between their newfound freedoms as well as the resistance to and repression of those freedoms by Southern whites.
The 14th Amendment states, "Nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws."
The 15th Amendment states, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous conditions of servitude."
Homer Plessy was an African-American activist living in Louisiana. He was a 1/8 black man who could be considered white. Homer Plessy joined a resistance group that wanted to test a Louisiana railway law that required separate but equal rail accommodations for blacks and whites. Plessy was arrested and his case was later heard in a Louisiana district court presided by Justice John Howard Ferguson. Ferguson agreed the law was unconstitutional in interstate rail cars, but felt states had the right to make laws about interstate rail cars.
On May 18, 1896, the Supreme Court handed down a decision that stated separate but equal was legal. The consequences of the decision in Plessy v. Ferguson was reactionary in that it legitimized the way black individuals were treated in Florida by creating a culture of segregation, disenfranchisement, and an unprecedented level of white-on-black violence. There were reactions to Plessy v. Ferguson.
This occurs in the context of what I like to call for my students a three-headed monster that rises in the 1890s. One is segregation, which is sort of the spatial segregation of Southern space. So you start to see signs that are put up that says this space is for white people, this space is for black people. That's one part of it. It occurs at the same time as disfranchisement legislation is passed in each Southern state, which is a sort of attempt to subvert, to sort of work around the 15th Amendment and to take away the right to vote from African Americans in the South. And the third is going to be an unprecedented level of racial violence, white-on-black violence. So all of these things are occurring at the same time in the 1890s. And what the Supreme Court does in the Plessy decision is to say, okay, well, the segregation aspect of this is okay, provided that separate accommodations are equal.
Plessy v. Ferguson led the way for states to begin establishing Jim Crow laws, which legalized segregation of white and black citizens in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Segregation occurred all over the South. The problem with Jim Crow laws were that they were meant to keep both races separate, but these laws only seemed to affect blacks. Police would often arrest blacks for breaking these laws, but usually never arrested whites for similar offenses.
Segregation didn't just occur in the streetcars, it also was occurring within schools in Florida. In 1913, a Florida Jim Crow law stated that black teachers could not teach white children and white teachers could not teach black children. If this law was not followed, the teacher could be fined up to $500 or 6 months in jail. Most time, the black students would be getting an inferior education compared to the white students.
Neighborhoods also tended to be segregated by some line, street, fence, gate, or barrier of some sort. Black citizens were restricted to areas with inadequate services, such as being the last neighborhood to have sewer pipes installed, fire, or police services. Black and white citizens were also segregated in public places such as movie entrances, churches, and restrooms.
It's clearly, since African Americans are forced to use these inferior facilities on the train, in the streetcars, in the movie theaters, since they're using inferior facilities, clearly they must be inferior, right? And clearly, since white people are using these superior facilities, they must be superior. So even though the Supreme Court rules separate but equal, I think it's important to realize that even in the 1880s, 1890s, that equal is never really there.
Segregation didn't end at death. Cemeteries were built to keep blacks and whites separated for all eternity. Today, an example of the past can be seen in Tarpon Springs, Florida, with two cemeteries. Cicadia Cemetery, where whites are buried, and just across the street, the Rose Cemetery, where blacks are buried. The Cicadia Cemetery is very nice compared to the Rose Cemetery. In fact, while all the graves in the Cicadia are nicely marked, the Rose has many poorly marked and unmarked graves.
Another result of Plessy versus Ferguson was the disenfranchisement of black citizens. Florida created the first poll tax in the United States. Most blacks were poor and had very little or no money, and most of the time could not pay the fee. The government intended this so that they could keep the blacks from voting.
The same year, 1889, Florida borrows a sort of trick from the state of South Carolina to further limit the voting rolls, to keep people from voting, which was the use of separate ballot boxes for each position that is being run for. So rather than simply depositing your ballot in one box, you'd have a whole bunch of boxes, and you'd have to put your governor ballot here, and your state senator ballot here, and your United States senator ballot here. And for illiterate Southerners, for people without much education, this becomes a challenging process. You have a number of different ballots in your hand. Where does it go? It's a way of, again, sort of forcibly lowering voting totals.
There were other ways the government kept blacks from voting. One way was a required literacy test. Due to the terrible schools that blacks were sent to, most did not know how to read or write, and some never even went to school. So they would most of the time fail the literacy tests and would not be able to vote. If a black did happen to pass, they would be given a tissue paper ballot known as a little joker. These were put in the ballot box and would later be removed.
A booklet published in the early 1900s instructs black men on how to vote. It was suggested that they pay their poll tax and are lawful citizens of their state.
Quote, "It is especially urged that as voters, you should seek to be on friendly terms with your white neighbors and the communities in which you live, so that you may consult with them about your common interests."
During the early 1900s in Florida and all across the South, whites were very violent to blacks. Many Southern whites at the time thought that they were superior to black men and women. Unfair trials and or no trials at all often led to mob lynchings. One example of this was the Rosewood Massacre. A black man was accused of hurting a white woman. Over several days in January 1923, whites attacked the black section of Rosewood, Florida. Angry mobs burned every structure in the black section of town, killing many innocent people. Most of the residents that lived in Rosewood fled to the woods for safety.
In conclusion, Plessy versus Ferguson was landmark legislation that led to segregation, disenfranchisement, and violence. In 1949, Florida Senator Spencer L. Holland began the process of discontinuing the poll tax by constitutional amendment. The Supreme Court decision in Brown versus Board of Education helped to further equality by desegregating schools. In the 1950s, the process of ending poll taxes and segregation was well underway with the rise of the Civil Rights Movement.
However, struggles continued in the 1960s and 70s with the construction of interstate system highways that separated black neighborhoods in major cities such as Central Park Village in Tampa, Florida. The violent riots of the 1980s and 1990s in Tampa and St. Petersburg, Florida, represented the reaction of the black community to the actions of the local police. In addition, in the presidential election of 2000, tens of thousands of African American voters in Florida were disenfranchised by being denied their right to vote.
Homer Plessy died on March 1, 1925, without seeing any justice. Recently, the descendants of Plessy and Ferguson met and reflected on their ancestors' history. Together, they created a foundation to provide civil rights education and outreach, symbolizing that reconciliation is possible even after years of struggles.